At the end of the 15th century, a young man named Martin Luther was coming to adulthood, and he spent a terrible lot of time thinking about his place before God, thinking about God's judgment on him if he should die. Had he confessed every sin that he had committed, would God have grace? Would God forgive him? It vexed him terribly. In fact, it drove him out of law school, for which, by the way, his father had paid handsomely. Drove him out of law school and into the monastery, because the teachings of the church at that time told people that the only place that you could really be sure that you were doing enough to warrant God's favor was in the priesthood or in the monastery. And so he went to the monastery. But even there, Luther did not find any peace. He struggled more than ever with this idea that he was not good enough, that he was never going to be good enough, and that no matter how hard he tried, he would never end up in heaven. Luther wasn't alone during this time and period in Europe. There were a lot of people that thought about this continually, every day. You can see it in the writings. You can see it in the very fact that people paid so much attention to the church's penance, to buying indulgences, to going on pilgrimages, to... Yeah, that too. It must be time to take my medicine. I'm sorry. What was behind that? Why was this culture, this society, so keyed in on what Paul calls the law? Because surely at that time, the law was giving knowledge of sin to these people. What was different then than today? A couple of things. One, the near universal influence of the church in Europe. There was hardly a nook or a cranny in Europe, any village, that was not considered to be completely and wholly part of Christendom. The church's influence was homogeneous, if you will, across Europe. And so the church spoke with a loud voice and with an unchallenged voice. There was not the academia, the professors at the universities speaking against what the church was teaching. There wasn't popular culture, no movie stars giving their acceptance speech at the Academy Awards, right, dissing godly living. That wasn't going on. The church held sway over the entire continent. But there was something else going on. One of those things was called the Black Plague, the bubonic plague. About 80 years before Luther, maybe a little bit before that, during the 14th century, the plague hit Europe with a force that had been unseen in times past. Now, this was the second major outbreak of bubonic plague in the world history, but this was devastating. Historians estimate that Europe lost perhaps half of its population in the century just before Martin Luther's life. Over 100 million people. That's incredible. And little outbursts of the plague would continue to pop up here and there in Europe all the way through Luther's day. But there was more. The average, now my numbers here are actually from 16th century England, but let's say that they are close for most of Europe. The average life expectancy for someone born in the 16th century during Luther's lifetime was a little over 39 years. Infant mortality was a large part of that low life expectancy. 12% of infants born would die before the age of 1. 36% would die before the age of 6. And of those children who made it past the age of 6, by the age of 17, 24% of that remaining group would die. So let's put that in a big round number. Before the age of 17, 60 of every 100 children born would die. This was a culture that faced their own mortality, and they faced it every single day. When that's what's going on around you, you think a lot about what happens if I'm next. The plague, when it broke out, you had a couple of days. If you contracted the disease, 2-3 days, it was a fast-acting disease. Luther was faced with this, and Luther thought about this. And with the church's voice being monolithic, and only speaking at that time, only speaking the law. Do this, do this, do this, go on this pilgrimage. Say this many Hail Marys, this many Our Fathers. Make sure that you have confessed every sin and then done penance for those. It's no wonder that Luther was consumed by this idea of never being good enough for God. So in 21st century America now, what's different? We look out in our cultural landscape and we don't see that kind of concern. We don't see that kind of introspection, that kind of thought about what is my relationship with God? Have I sinned and not confessed? What have I done to violate God's law? People in our culture, in our society, are not asking that question. Even a lot of people who sit in churches on Sunday mornings don't ask that question. And so we look at maybe some of those influences and how they might have changed from the 16th century to now. Certainly, the church no longer has the single homogeneous voice in society, especially in American society. We live in a very diverse culture. a lot of voices speaking a lot of different perceived truths. And some of those truths in the last 30 years, if you will, have turned to the postmodern side, and basically that means that this postmodern teaching says there is no way to prove an ultimate truth. So what is truth for one person may not be truth for another person. My experience might be different than your experience, and therefore I might perceive truth differently than the way you do. That's not all bad, though, guys. There's some good news for a person who is actually bearing the gospel there. We'll get to that another day. Suffice it to say that we are in a very fractured and diverse culture with many voices speaking. But compare life expectancy rates in the 21st century to those in the 16th century. If a baby is born today in America, their life expectancy is over the age of 78. Over 39 to almost 79. That's a huge swing. 40 extra years. A lot of that goes to prenatal care, to infant health. Infant mortality rate is drastically lower than it was. But more than that, look at the diseases that modern medicine has been able to contain, or in the American experience, almost eradicate. Tuberculosis. When was the last time you met someone with consumption? Polio, a disease that was widespread even in the middle of the last century, virtually unheard of now. Except for those folks who refuse to get immunizations, mumps, measles, and rubella. I mean, almost completely contained in our culture and society, except for the pockets of places where people have rejected this gift that God has given us in modern medicine. And when someone does get sick, when someone gets very sick, what happens? We take them to the hospital. That's not bad, okay? That's where they can get treatment. That's where they can be diagnosed. But it can also be bad, because that's also where the sick people are closed off from us, put in a safe place, keep us safe from having to worry about them. It's almost sad that the joke goes, where do people go to die today? Well, they go to the hospital to die, instead of surrounded by the loved ones in their house. Our culture is obsessed with youth, obsessed with putting off death at all costs. We may not think about sin and our relationship with God in the way that Luther's culture did, but let me tell you this, nothing has changed in the human condition from that day to today. Nothing has changed in the way that we relate to a pure, holy, and righteous God. Nothing has changed. And subconsciously we know that. And that's why we fight so hard to put off old age, to shield ourselves from even the thought of death. When a loved one is approaching an age where they say, I'm ready to go home, what do we say? Oh, don't talk about that right now. No, you don't want to go home yet. They're saying something very good and healthy. I have faith in my God, and I'm ready to go see him. Why do we say, shh, don't say that? Why do we say that? Because we are uncomfortable with this little voice in the back of our head that is holding us accountable to God, that is bringing us the knowledge of sin, of true death. God's Spirit is at work, but our culture, our society doesn't hear it in the same words that Luther's culture heard it in. Since the year 2000, worldwide, the suicide rate has dropped by almost 30%. During that same time, in the United States, suicide has increased by 33%. Several months ago, I shared some statistics with you about loneliness, and sociologists cry that loneliness is the new epidemic in the United States, and how people are being isolated, even with this new technology that we have that keeps us connected even when we want to sleep, or should be sleeping. We're alone. We feel isolated. We feel deserted sometimes. Brokenness. When we look at our world and we look at the events that happen in our world, we see brokenness. When we look at our own emotions, honestly, we see brokenness. In Japan, a piece of pottery that might be hundreds and hundreds of years old, but is in pristine condition, perfect condition, is seen as only second best to a piece of pottery that had been shattered and broken and then put back together with gold inlay and repaired. And the artistry of recreating this piece of pottery is seen as being more valuable than if that piece of pottery had never been damaged. Let me suggest to you that as organizations like the Lutheran Women's Mission League, when you go out into society today to share that message of hope, just like Jesus did, many times you will be met with blank stares. Just like Jesus was when he said, "If you abide in my word, you're truly my disciples, and you'll know the truth, and the truth will set you free." But listen to what some of the Jews said to him. We've never been slaves. We were born in the covenant. We've never been slaves. We're free to worship God. How can you say that we're slaves? Our culture is going to say that same thing back to us as we go to places like Dupree Elementary School or to Neighborhood House or Mosaic. But if we look at the way we speak carefully, and if we look at our culture and our society and look at the ways that they are hurting, and we use the words that reach them to convey the freedom that Jesus Christ can give to a broken, to a lonely person. When we uncover the brokenness in their lives and let them see that brokenness for what it is, that is when God's law can start to speak to them. Grace is cheap if you don't realize that your relationship with God is broken without the grace of Christ. Once you realize that the brokenness and the pain and the anguish in your heart, in your soul, in your life is there not because other people are bad and want to hurt you, but because you've been disconnected from the source of life, from God the Father. That's when the truth can set you free. That's when the grace of God, that's when this thing called the gospel can set you free. The message that Luther rediscovered in the 16th century needs to be rediscovered today, but in a new way. We need to throw away the cheap grace. We need to throw away the, oh, God will forgive you, go ahead and do it mentality. We need to throw away maybe some of the churchy words that we use to communicate to those who are outside of the church, and look for ways to communicate to them the love of God that can touch them in their brokenness. It's fun to celebrate Reformation Day. It really is. And it's even more fun to celebrate Reformation Day when you realize how free you can be in the truth that Jesus Christ is. Amen.